welcome to the Transfer Exchange Show. We are live and we have a guest for us today. It's Ben Jacobs from CBS Sports Golazo. How you doing, Ben?
Golazo! You got to get into the spirit of things. That's what they shout in North, South, and Central America when the goals go in. Good to see you guys.
Wow! Oh my word! I should let you do the intro. Absolutely smashed it. All right. We're joined by Ben Jacobs from CBS Football Golazo.
Hey, there it is.
Bang. All right. Do you know what, Ben? I'm taking notes. I've got a couple of questions for you about commentating. We'll get onto that in a bit. First of all, we're going to speak about Leicester, your club, and stuff like that. But let me introduce my co-host tonight. It's Steve K. How you doing, Steve?
Yeah, how you doing, Kieran? How you doing, Ben? Looking forward to tonight.
All right. So, Ben, we're going to start off with Leicester, your team. Yeah, it's been a bit of not a shaky start to the season, but it's been a bit on and off, up and down. How would you say the season's gone so far?
Yeah, I think you've put it absolutely perfectly. They've returned to kind of mid-table mediocrity, which is either where the team should be or it's below the expectations of previous seasons. And obviously, when you have a manager like Brendan Rodgers, hugely in demand by a number of clubs, and you've got the talent currently there that may not still be there in January, you have to kind of capitalize because unfortunately, and I say this as a fan, when you're a club like Leicester, if you don't continue to stay within that European spot and elevate yourself a kind of above the best of the rest, if you like, within that mid-table, then come these transfer windows, you start to lose the players because you're only really luring in a Yuri Tielemans, Harvey Barnes, and so on, based on the fact that you've got European football. So now I look at Leicester's season and I kind of see two patterns. One is that they're likely to finish certainly outside of the Champions League spots and very possibly outside of Europe. And then two, they have to kind of reshift the expectations and, in my opinion, prioritize Europa League football to keep that European run going as long as possible, again, to keep the core together. Because if they don't, they'll go out of the Europa League, and they had disappointment in the knockout stages last season as well in that particular tournament. And then suddenly you're mid-table in the Premier League. And at that point, you're always teetering on the edge of losing two or three core names and having taken one step forwards towards a side that most people would have said would be regularly challenging for European football, you take two steps back. And the real danger is exactly that. And it weirdly reminds me this season of when Leicester played under Martin O'Neill. And I don't kind of make that comparison because we were as good back then as now, but by our own standards, it's exactly the same position. And I remember that Leicester had a game and we had an amazing squad and we played Sunderland and we put 5 goals past them in the Premier League. It was one of our best performances at the old Filbert Street. We had Emile Heskey, we had Stan Collymore, we had Robbie Savages, Neil Lennon, Steve Guppies. There was a real balance to the side. We had Martin O'Neill. And then about 2-3 weeks later, everything just collapsed. And Stan Collymore broke his leg against Derby. Emile Heskey left for Liverpool and Martin O'Neill left as well. And then suddenly the club were never able to kind of recover. And that's my worry with Leicester, that we're shipping a lot of goals. We haven't kind of found a formula yet to consistently get the best out of the players around Jamie Vardy. So you either redefine Vardy and then play through an Iheanacho or other kind of forward-thinking players. And obviously Daka is the new one that's come into the mix there that's very similar to Vardy. And it's not kind of clicked with that chemistry because there's too many similar elements between that front line. So then you either become Jamie Vardy-centric and teams kind of find you out quite quickly, or alternatively, you try and bring in the next generation of players. And then to do that, because they're not going to just hit goal scoring form out of nowhere, you're reliant on the sort of Maddisons to find his form more consistently. And more importantly, you need Tielemans to be box to box and the defence to keep clean sheets. And we're letting in too many goals. And probably other than Tielemans and Vardy, there's just not enough consistent players so far this season to take us from mid-table to potentially a top 4 side.
Was it Mickey Adams that took over from Martin O'Neill that after he left, was it?
Yeah, I mean, we had a sort of merry-go-round of managers, really, but
Yeah.
Adams was one of them. And
it was also bad buys as well. Was it Adi Akinbaye? It was about, I think, 7 million.
Adi Akin bad buy, as he was known.
He just couldn't get a goal, and he's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger by the game, just getting hench. It was just like, what are you doing? Do you worry that the players that you're talking about, some of your star players like Maddison, Tielemans, and Ndidi, Barnes, do you feel like they're coming to a point in their career where it's like, is it time to move on? And they all seem to come in there at the same time or a similar time.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that there's not going to be a mass exodus. And it's really important to understand that Leicester's ownership group, historically and now, under the Thai owners, have always been pretty bullish about their star assets. So even the ones that have gone in the past, I mean, they got an incredible fee for Harry Maguire, and Manchester United realised they were on the short end of that deal now, don't they? And then if you look at Mahrez, he was kind of forced in a transfer saga to stay at the football club a lot longer than he wanted as well. So, naturally, every name under the sun that's doing well for Leicester or has huge potential will be linked, but it doesn't mean they're all going to leave. So I think that Kasper Schmeichel will stay. I don't think that Maddison will go, nor do I really think on current form there's necessarily a huge step up for him. The two worries for me, along with Rodgers leaving, would be Barnes and Tielemans. And Tielemans in particular is a hot property in football. And much like when Leicester had N'Golo Kante, even though they're different kinds of players, it's just going to be very hard to stop somebody coming in for him, especially with Leicester not in Champions League football. So the biggest kind of stress, if I was Leicester's ownership group, is historically, because they've had 2 good seasons before this season, both of which they could and should have got into the Champions League. And if you do that, you can breathe easy, and you're more than likely to keep a Tielemans for as long as you stay in Europe. And then you get the money and the lure to bring in other names to build a spider around them. And ultimately you get the financial investment to replace them, even if they go. But now, having just missed out, the Europa League is not a lure for Tielemans. So if a big club comes in for him, I think he'll go. And that's my worry for the January transfer window, is that if Leicester lose Tielemans, not only do they potentially start to solidify in mid-table mediocrity rather than climbing in the right direction, but then Vardy will need replacing in the long term, and you can't be over-reliant on goals for him. And then at some point, Rodgers may say, well, hang on a minute, I was prime real estate as a manager when Leicester were pushing for Champions League, but if we start heading in the wrong direction, I think it will solidify in his mind the need to move to a bigger club before he's in a position where he's not doing well enough to attract a bigger club.
Is Wilfred Ndidi important to you, Ben? But there's a lot of rumours going around about him, especially now coming up to the January transfer window. I know from what I do that his name keeps coming up all the time. Is he someone, like the ones you mentioned, that it's important to keep?
Yeah, I mean, Ndidi, for me, is not in the same bracket as Tielemans. But again, they're slightly different kind of players. And what Ndidi gives you is box to box, but also the tenacity and the tactical nous. And he can control a midfield, and he can drop deep and sit in front of a back 4 or a back 3. And he's got that sort of versatility to not just move into those different positions, but see a pass. And it's a strange thing to say, because a lot of the passes that he makes are quite simple, but they're positive. And in that split second, you get a lot of kind of defensive midfielders, box-to-box midfielders that do the running and the finishing well, but they don't often spot a pass. And even if that pass is simple, it's not simple in the sense that you have to execute it quickly. And if you miss the run, if you don't see it to execute that simple pass, the moment's gone. And Danny Drinkwater at Leicester was very good at that as well. And Ndidi falls into that category. I think if I had to pick, I would probably prefer still to keep a Tielemans and lose an Ndidi. But naturally, they offer different kinds of assets. And I think Ndidi in particular is being looked at by Manchester United. But Manchester United, for me, is not necessarily a step up in terms of move, because you need to learn a lesson if you're a Leicester City player of Ndidi's ilk. It doesn't apply to Tielemans, it does apply to Ndidi. And I mean this with no disrespect. But if you look at the Leicester players like Drinkwater, and Ndidi for me is exactly in that category, that take a step up. Is he going to play at Manchester United regularly? I would probably say no. I mean, when Van der Beek can't even get a game, I'm not entirely sure that Ndidi would come in and play regularly for Manchester United. He'd become a squad player. And then if you factor in that in those big games, he's probably not going to be one of the 11 on the starting list. Other than financial, if a footballer wants to play, where's the appeal in leaving Leicester City if you're Ndidi? Whereas if you're Tielemans, I think you can pick almost any club in Europe and get a game in the starting 11.
You got Bakary Samir as well, haven't you? In that midfield, you could. I mean, he's only young, so he could always cover him if he did leave.
Leicester won't have a problem though replacing. I mean, the club are not afraid to spend, and as I said before, if they're going to let these players go, you can bet your bottom dollar they're going to let them go for a quasi-astronomical transfer fee, because that's how the club operate. They hold out for the best deal they can get, and then if you have that money in, you've got all kinds of possibilities that you can add to the squad. But the frustrating thing, and it sounds a bit greedy having won the Premier League and knowing that, you know, other teams will return to their historical glory, if you like. But when you look at Leicester on paper, you look at the manager we've got, Brendan Rodgers, you look at the style of football that we've played. And I think in missing out on the Champions League, we were still playing better than when we won the Premier League. So then you start to say, as a greedy fan, taking the kind of journalist hat off, why couldn't we have just got over the line one of those 2 seasons? Because it would have given the opportunity to transform the club and put us on a path where we can almost become one of the big 6. And I know sort of like a Newcastle fan will be saying, well, we're going to be part of the big 6. And I know that a Tottenham and an Arsenal fan will be saying, we're going to be coming back into the big 6. And if you look at money, the Newcastle fans are right. If you look at brand and history, the Tottenham and the Arsenal fans are right. But football doesn't work like that. And right now, you're actually looking at a West Ham United and a Leicester City as the 2 sort of contenders from outside the historically big clubs that have got the infrastructure and the chemistry. But the question is, how short-lived is that? And I think West Ham are actually in a healthier position because they've got a worse manager in Moyes than Brendan Rodgers, but they're a London club. And even though Leicester's only a 90-mile drive outside of London, I think being in London as you grow and having that stadium, even though Leicester, again, have got a very nice stadium, it gives them those foundational aspects to genuinely stay within the big 6 if they have that 1 or 2 good seasons where they solidify themselves there. And Leicester have almost solidified themselves there. You look at 2015, 2016 until now, and we've basically been in the top 4 more than we've been outside of the top 4, and we've finished in the top 6 consistently. So huge credit for that transformation. But where do Leicester go from now? And hopefully this drop in form is just a blip because we are defensively weaker than we have been in previous seasons. And if we can just find a solution at the back, the goals and the talent are still there, but it's that strategy longer term, because what Leicester perhaps don't quite have is the depth. And if Vardy goes because he's ultimately pushing his peak at Premier League level in the next season or 2, and then if you lose a Tielemans and potentially a Brendan Rodgers, you could find yourselves in a bit of a mess, dropping 6 or 7 places further down the table, and then it's a lot harder to climb back upwards.
Are you worried about Brendan Rodgers leaving?
Yeah, I think every Leicester fan is. But by the same token, he is only really going to leave for a handful of gigs. So he's not going abroad. Even I think if a Barcelona or a Real Madrid slightly farcically came calling, that's not where he's going to go. He's not going to return back to Liverpool. He was very clear, and I know this from talking to sources, not just from what perhaps people have read in the media, that he was never interested in the Newcastle United job. So I think Manchester United, despite his Liverpool links, is probably the only job that he'd go for. And thankfully for Leicester, it doesn't actually look like Solskjaer is going to go anytime soon. And even if he does, Zinedine Zidane is hovering as well. So Rodgers is probably a good fit for Manchester United. But if it isn't Manchester United, I don't see currently a better gig than Leicester, given he didn't want to go to Newcastle. I think he believes in what he's building at Leicester. Now, that may change if he loses some players or if form doesn't go in Leicester's favour. The worry is only the fact that, and it's always a worry, when you're Leicester City and you're outside of Champions League qualification, every single aspect of the football club, from the manager to your players to your backroom staff, are all potentially poachable, because there are clubs that can pay bigger wages and are at bigger levels than Leicester. So you want that loyalty, but over time, you can't expect the loyalty if someone comes calling. And I think that's the worry in the longer term, that Brendan Rodgers might only stay at Leicester for another season or 2 if we don't qualify for Champions League or Europe again, or the Manchester United job comes up, there's a possibility he might leave a bit sooner. But right now, I would say that I'm pretty confident that he'll remain at Leicester until the end of this season.
It's a very dangerous job, isn't it? It's a very dangerous move if he was to move to Manchester United, Ben. You know, he's always been on the up, Brendan Rodgers. He's always did well at Liverpool, then he went to Celtic, then he's gone to Leicester. He's continued his CVs. At the moment, Man United job is like a poison chalice. I'd be surprised if anybody wants it. And there's always that danger. He goes there, and look, over the last 4 managers that Man United have had, it hasn't worked. So there is, and look at the type of managers that have gone there. You know, the Mourinho's and people like that. So personally, I think he's probably better off staying at Leicester and improving them, possibly getting them in the top 4.
I think the difference is at Leicester, he's a part of the strategic decision making, and he wouldn't have as much control at Manchester United, even though every manager will come in and negotiate to have elements of control. I think Rodgers has got a bit more of an authority at Leicester than he would carry at Manchester United. And I think Manchester United are very old-fashioned in the way that they operate behind the scenes. So consistently, people are judging Manchester United on their history, on what Ferguson did, on the players that they buy, which on paper, you know, is still a very strong football team. But the best isn't being gotten out of them. And it's not just that. It's that foundationally, there's a lot of things wrong at Manchester United in how they scout talent, in an over-reliance on their ego and their brand globally, which is allowing other football clubs to catch up, in the interaction between manager and boardroom, the relationship even between managers and fans, because it was always going to be hard to develop the same kind of affinity, especially if you don't stay for as long comparative to Sir Alex Ferguson. And I think that's ultimately why, first of all, they went for Solskjaer eventually, and second of all, they're staying with him, because everyone remembers still inside Old Trafford that Solskjaer has won it, commentary from Clive Tilsley, and because of that legendary status, he has been given a little bit more time. But fundamentally, they don't know what direction they're heading in. What they know is that things are not quite working, but there's too many voices. There's the voice of the brands, there's the voice of the Americans, there's the voice of the boardroom, there's the voice of the manager, there's the voice of the players. And perversely, bringing in a Ronaldo is not going to help with those different voices. So what you get is a very similar situation, I think, at least prior to Xavi, to the Barcelona dressing room as well. And I think that is a football club that behind the scenes, in the way it operates and the way it implements its strategy on and off the football field, is just a little bit toxic. And if you come in and you're Brendan Rodgers and you're used to having an open door policy with your ownership group and a smaller club where you've got a more hands-on say about everything, not just the football decisions, but every decision, to walk into Manchester United is a challenge. And I'm not saying he wouldn't take that challenge, but it would also be a real culture shock as well. It's not as marketable job as you might think. And Newcastle United, to a lot of the managers that were in the mix there, not as marketable as you might think as well. And managers now are a lot savvier because they know exactly what they want to bring to a club. And when they've got a job and they've got a reputation compared to being out of work, they have the leverage. So they know exactly what they want to bring, who they want to bring, what they want to spend. And they can say, well, if you're not going to give me that element of control and that financial war chest, then I'll stay put because I'm happy and I'm settled. And that's why I think it's very telling that when these big jobs come up, often, not in every case, but often, it somehow ends up being the out of works. And you sort of think to yourself, well, if I was employing in any other sector for the biggest jobs in the world, I would be headhunting somebody that was successful and in a job. And yet, when Man United comes up, the first names and the real contenders tend to be the ones out of work. When Newcastle comes up, they go through a range of names. I know Emery was in work, but they generally go through a range of names that are out of work. And who do they end up finally getting? Eddie Howe, who was out of work. And I think that's telling. When a football club does that, it suggests to me that they perhaps haven't got the lure to attract the biggest names to move from one job to another work, as opposed to unemployed into their job.
Yeah, definitely. Do you not think that as managers, footballers, they have an ego and they feel like they could make that change. They could be the ones that turn things round. Do you think that would have be a lure for someone like Rodgers?
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think at his age, for sure, and with his CV, the danger is just if history shows you that the average stay post-Ferguson of a Manchester United manager is just a season, and then history tells you that after you leave Manchester United, it can be relatively difficult to bounce back into a big job, if you like, then if you're happy and settled and think you're doing well and building and think you've got time on your side, then perhaps you're put off making that move. I still don't think there's many managers that would turn Manchester United down, though. And in fairness, the irony of the post-Ferguson era is if you look at the so-called flops, they're all doing okay. And they actually have all recovered. Mourinho's at Roma. Louis van Gaal's just qualified the Netherlands for the 2022 Qatar World Cup. David Moyes is flying with West Ham United. So there actually is an element of being able to recover your CV after, in inverted commas, failing at Manchester United. But you have to know with that job what you're getting in for. You almost have to treat it like a takeover, not a managerial transfer, and do your due diligence. Otherwise, if you walk into that football club and you get off to the wrong start in terms of your relationships with those behind the scenes, the ownership group, the bigger egos, Brendan Rodgers worked with some big names at Liverpool naturally and had one or two at Celtic. And there's big personalities in the dressing room, but none of them compare to that voice and that sway and that say of Cristiano Ronaldo. So then given his age, and you've got Pogba as well, if Rodgers comes in, and we're speaking hypothetically, obviously, and says, well, actually, I don't think Cristiano Ronaldo is the right fit for this team. And I don't think Maguire is good enough to keep his place, even though he's the captain. So I'm going to change the captaincy and all these other decisions. How well is that going to be received by the wider dressing room, the fan base, the ownership group? And that's where I think all these different voices talking behind your back, trying to exert an influence, not much of that exists at Leicester. Of course, in football, it does exist. Like, we're not naive enough to come on and say that football doesn't have that kind of whispery, backstabbing element. But if you think it's bad at Leicester, I suppose is my point, it'll be 100 times worse at Manchester United. And it just may be that Brendan Rodgers is not the kind of coach or personality, especially having learnt from the parts he maybe didn't enjoy at Liverpool, to want to put that pressure on himself, even if his ego and his head and his heart sort of say, I'd be nuts to turn the role down.
Yeah, very true. I feel like he would have learnt a bit along the way, as you said, with his time when he was at Liverpool, even when he was at Chelsea. He's worked with Hazard, John Terry, Ashley Cole, Lampard, Mourinho. He's worked for all of them himself. So I think he would be a great manager for Man United. And I think it would, as you said before, it would have to be something where he's got a bit more control than any other Man United manager has had probably since Ferguson. So he could build from the ground up, and he can make sure that all the infrastructure for Man United growing and getting back to where they should be is being built there, and not sort of just building on top of a bad foundation. One thing that Leicester have got is a great scouting network. Are you worried about them being poached? Because you say you're worried about certain players leaving, but as you've spoken about earlier, Mahrez, Kante, Maguire, they've all come and gone, and they're being replaced. And you've got Sionchu in there, you've got Harvey Barnes, you've got a quality team, and every time a player comes in, you just replace him. Surely you should have the faith in the scouting network.
Yeah, I mean, the scouting network generally at Leicester have kind of historically been poached, and there's not too many of them left at the football club that unearthed a Kante or a Mahrez, and Leicester's kind of star name behind the scenes used to be a guy called Steve Walsh, who's now a special advisor at the Major League Soccer club Charlotte. And there was another scout called Ben Wrigglesworth as well, who went to Arsenal. And these were the kind of unsung heroes finding those names. And now Rodgers has come in. There's kind of a new generation of people working alongside him on the scouting side, on the football science and data side, to unearth the kind of next range of untapped bargain talent. And I'm not too worried about where Leicester are looking or who they might find, in the same way that Brentford have just decided and did when they were a championship side that it was Denmark. That was the untapped place where you would look. Leicester have often invested a lot of time and manpower into the lower leagues of France. They've looked into Africa as well. We've got a strong history, in particular, in signing Nigerian players, both now and previously. And a number of them have kind of been star players for Leicester as well. And you just know that Rodgers has got that kind of global network himself, and also has quite a hands-on say in the type of player that he wants to find in terms of their attributes. So Leicester's scouting system doesn't worry me, even though, as I say, the physical brains, if you like, that picked some of our box office players in the past are long gone now. But it isn't just about the scouting network at the club. It's about the infrastructure. So I think when people talk about scouting, they think it is solely about, wow, you found a player, you signed a player, that player was good. And I think what fans need to understand is that there's a gap in that chronology between those two. Because what you actually do is you find a player, you settle a player, you train a player, you bring a player through, and then you develop the player, and then they come and shine on the stage. And they may do that very quickly within a couple of years, but all of that middle part that often gets forgotten between scouting and the player making their debut is about, does the player feel comfortable at the football club? What are the training facilities like? Is there integration between the junior teams and the senior team? Is there mentoring? Have they got nice housing? Are they looked after off the football field? Are they being given an education? And that's where Leicester building a brand new training facility and having a hands-on manager in that Klopp mould that watches the younger teams train, that puts his arm around players, that spends one-on-one time with a lot of the squad members and so on to enthuse and motivate and mentor them. That for me is as powerful at Leicester City and other clubs as well that do it well as the scouting itself, because that helps you turn a potential into a reality.
How much do you think people underestimate what you've just said there with regards to a player settling? Because we've seen many players come with higher price tags and great talent when they're in other leagues, and people expect them to come to the Premier League and just hit the ground running, or give it a couple of months there to be okay. But they're not taking into account, as you said, the lifestyle. Are they happy at home? What are they doing? Because it's being at the football ground is a small part. Being at the training ground, the rest of the time you're at home. Are you alone? Do you have family there? Do you have friends there? Do you think people underestimate the power of that?
I think so, and I think it's because, rightly from a fan perspective, I suppose, even though it's a warped vantage point, they're only seeing their team on the field on a Saturday, so to them that's the culmination of the week, and that's only one day out of 7 that a footballer has to get in their car, come to the training facility, interact with their squad, go home, and so on. So it's really important that people understand that when you judge a team and you try and determine, do they like each other, do they play well together, do they gel, you don't actually know unless you're watching the training and the match and you're looking at the different personalities and the dynamic between them. And I think that there's a Leicester example of that in Riyad Mahrez, who did not perform for Leicester in his first season and a half. And everybody looks at the year that we won the Premier League and maybe the last 11 games under Nigel Pearson during the so-called Great Escape, and they go, wow, Mahrez is a great player. But I can tell you, watching Leicester City every single week, that for the first year and a bit that he was at the football club, if not longer, he was selfish with the ball. He stayed out wide rather than cutting inside. He wasted set pieces. He got to bylines and didn't look up and play an extra pass or use his vision. And he didn't score that many goals. And at that point, Leicester could have stuck or twisted on him because there were a range of other players. And other Leicester names falling into that category are, for example, Damari Gray, who never made it really at Leicester to his full potential, but very similar in the sense of exceptionally fast, very skillful, but also quite selfish on the ball and lacked a football brain at times. And luckily for Leicester, they were able to develop Mahrez through hard work on the training ground and through integrating him into British society and ultimately Leicester culture, if you like, to the point where he felt settled enough to shine and gel with his teammates. And then if you go outside of Leicester to a bigger example, look at Messi at PSG. most people say greatest player in the world, currently at least, up there with Ronaldo, shines for Barcelona. He's aging, but he's still single-handedly succeeding in that team when he's at Barcelona. He moves to PSG. Now, granted, he's done okay in the Champions League, even though at the moment he's injured, but he hasn't scored a goal yet in Ligue 1. And why is that? Well, there's all kinds of theories that people will say about he doesn't like it in Paris. He's not settled in the club. He's not playing well under Poch's system. He doesn't get on with the other egos in the football club and so on. And, you know, newspaper stories will tell you aspects of each of them is true. But fundamentally, it's the first time since he joined Barcelona that Lionel Messi has had to move a club, has had to get in a different car, live in a different house, go in a different dressing room, speak to people in a predominantly different languages, in the sense that it's a mostly French-speaking squad. And there may be times where he's not kind of comfortable communicating. And the fact that even though he's the star, he is of an older generation now than other young stars, particularly Mbappe at PSG, who's stealing all of the headlines. And there's that kind of young clique, the Neymar, Mbappe aspect to the football club, which may be as big as Messi right now in the moment, even if kind of historically Messi carries that bigger kind of gravitas and statistics as a footballer. And it's the first time in his career that he's maybe realizing, one, that he's on the, loosely speaking, down by insane magical Messi standards. I use the word down, of course, but two, he's just transitioning to a new place. And whether your player is young, whether he's coming through a youth system, or whether he's old and comes with a reputation, it takes its toll. And I think we're seeing that just as much with Messi as any other player. So the solution to make him settle is kind of to somehow give him the safe space that he had at Barcelona. But there's so much fanfare around the move and the transfer fee, and it's probably harder to walk around the center of Paris as Messi than maybe it was back in his home in Barcelona and so on, even though they're both big cities. So I do think that whole, what's the player doing away from match days? How are they settling? Where are they living? Who are their friendship groups? How's their mental health? How's their physical health? How's their family settled in? How are their kids getting on at school with their new friendship groups? I think all of that is a big, big factor into getting the best out of any footballer.
That's a massive point, especially for someone of Messi's age. Is your kids, are they happy? If you're coming home after a day's work and your kids and the missus are not happy, like because they're in an area and they've not got their friends around them, they're not, your kids, you uproot your kids and they've got to move to another school, you're going to feel that. That's going to be on the back of your mind. And was that the right move? Should I have stayed? Should I have taken a pay? Not that it was really his choice. Should I have done this? Should I have done? Could I have done all I could to maybe stay? Did I make the right move? 100%. And we had Rohan Ricketts on last week, and he said when he moved abroad and there was a language barrier, he could understand certain words, but he didn't understand the tone and the way when they put them words in during the game. So he was getting offended by things his teammates were saying, but they were like, no, calm down. We're just angry at the situation. So there could be little things like little nuances like that Messi may not understand because he's French to Spanish. So yeah, completely right, 100%. So another club you mentioned earlier, Newcastle United. Is there some sort of something in the back of your mind that they could potentially be a club that could really push on? Do you feel like they're going the right route with regards to the players they're trying to bring in? Do you think that Eddie Howe was a good appointment?
I do think Eddie Howe was a good appointment, primarily because Newcastle are in a relegation battle and they need someone that can get them out of trouble whilst playing an attacking form of football. And that is exactly what Howe did in the two previous seasons at Bournemouth before he got them relegated. And he's kind of tarnished, unfortunately, by that final season at Bournemouth, but he's taken them up through the divisions and turned them into a very attractive Premier League side for the majority of their stay on a shoestring budget. So I think that he has the potential now to completely approach Newcastle in a different way because of the financial weight behind him. But at the same time, bring all of his experience about uniting a football team, making them play with a kind of smile on their face, and ultimately getting them out of trouble. And the timing of his appointment allows him that January window to get them out of trouble. I think that the alarm bells around Newcastle are more to do with the fragmentation of the ownership group and the football club. So if we're talking about where they can go, first of all, they need a unity and a strategy. And I'm not seeing any of that at the moment, because the takeover happened very quickly, despite the long sagas and delays before that. It suddenly was just approved.
Out of nowhere. Yeah.
And that's because the piracy issue in the Middle East and North Africa between Saudi Arabia and Qatar and in sports and Saudi Arabia specifically was resolved. And then lo and behold, the Premier League don't have a problem with it, and the takeover happens. But what you have is the majority ownership group from Saudi Arabia, the public investment funds, who are, despite their push for transparency during the takeover saga, actually pretty anonymous at the moment. And the chairman, Yasser Al-Rumayyan, who owns 80% of the football club, is not speaking, is not engaging with either media or fans. And then you have the Rubin brothers, who I think are the most stable of the three, because they know the Newcastle landscape and they've worked before in the community. And then you have Amanda Staveley, who is effectively the face and voice of the football club at the moment. And that's fine if she is speaking, one, to deflect from Saudi Arabian voices because they know that people are going to ask about piracy and human rights and so on. But two, it's fine if what she's saying is in unison and unity with what the full ownership group thinks. But unfortunately, what's happened at Newcastle from the word go is that Jamie Rubin wanted Frank Lampard, Amanda Staveley wanted Paulo Fonseca, and the Public Investment Fund wanted a big name manager. And eventually they decided that Emery was a kind of compromise between the two. They were positive they were going to get him, and then they didn't. And then they go for Eddie Howe. Now, when you recruit for a manager and it's all played out in public, I do have an element of sympathy, because there's other managerial appointments that will go through lots of failed approaches and the press just won't find out about them. But the nagging doubt, coming back to your question, is less about what happened and more about the names, because the philosophy and style of an Unai Emery versus an Eddie Howe and those
massively different
candidates, they couldn't be further apart. So Emery is going to be more patient, more defensive minded. He might play with a back three. Eddie Howe's likely to play a 4-3-2-1 or a 4-2-3-1. He's going to play attacking football. He's going to play with width. He's going to get the ball forwards a lot more. And I think Newcastle fans will like that. But if you're down to the last two, and those two are so different in philosophy, it suggests to me that there's no strategy in place for where they want to take the football club. Then they're going to add a director of football after the appointment of the manager. And again, that relationship and that dynamic between manager and director of football has a question mark by it. And then, of course, what happens to Eddie Howe? So if Eddie Howe does badly, then Newcastle United, in all probability, get relegated. If Eddie Howe does well, then the following season, there's going to be pressure on him. And then if Newcastle spend big and are mid-table the following season, even if that puts them 20 points clear of relegation, Howe's perversely under pressure, and they might find themselves changing their manager once again. So it feels a bit like an all or nothing job for Howe, in the sense that he could come in and take them down, or he could come in and within 2 seasons, because of the money behind him, get them into Europe. But anything in between. And I worry that Newcastle's ownership group might get a little bit frustrated and might look to chop and change, because the club will be more marketable to other managers once Newcastle United are definitely safe. So if they're patient, and if there's unity, and if there's transparency, and they spend well, and spending well to begin with means not just going for box office names, but buying savvy players. So go and try and get an Ndidi or a Tillemans off my team, Leicester, or bring back an Iosi Perez. Go and get a Lewis Dunk or a Tyrone Mings, because these are the players that are going to get you out of trouble, and they give you a foundation to move you towards a top 6 or a top 10 team. And then 2-3 years down the line, Newcastle should be a superpower. But obviously, if they went down this season under Howe, which is still a big possibility, then they could set themselves back potentially 2 to 5 years.
Do you think the fans are going to be more patient than the owners, it seems?
I think the fans are great, and they've had such a frustrating time under Mike Ashley that the honeymoon period will be longer than ever before in the last probably 50 years at Newcastle United, maybe since Kevin Keegan, where I think win or lose, the fans were kind of behind him, and definitely under Bobby Robson as well, obviously, just because there was that affinity. And what I love about the fan base is that they're vocal and they can get frustrated, but they are loyal, probably more loyal than any other set of fans in the Premier League, which means that if they develop an affinity with the ownership group, which they have, and the manager, which they have, that bond, if the right things are being said, the right style is being played, the right effort is being shown, that bond, regardless of the results, won't be that breakable, in my opinion, which will give Eddie Howe and the owners a fair amount of time. But the fan base also are very proactive and they want accountability, and they're not prepared to let the club slip back into the faceless, unloved limbo stage where Mike Ashley was in charge, but he'd effectively discarded the club. So if they get even an inkling over time that this ownership group are not who they say they are, or they're not going to do what they've promised to do, or if they get a sense that Eddie Howe is the wrong man for the job, I do think there'll be an element of fan revolt. But I think as long as he starts positively and gets them out of trouble this season, I do see the kind of honeymoon period of post-Ashley lasting potentially up to a season or two.
Yeah.
I think they had to be really careful as far as when they got their manager in. I mean, that's the first part of what the new owners had to do. And, you know, as good as a manager that Unai Emery is, he would have been totally the wrong choice as far as I'm concerned. This is a guy who's a serial winner, if you like. He's won everything. There was win at PSG. You know, he's done well in Spain. He's been up the top. He's challenged for the Ligas. You know, when he's won European Cups. You know, this is not a guy you want to bring in to someone to try and save you from relegation. You need someone who's came in, who knows the Premier League, well, the bottom part of it. You know, he's brought Bournemouth up from nowhere, and he's someone who has took Bournemouth up into the top, round about the 10th of the table, and he's kept them there. So when you look at Newcastle at this moment in time, that's exactly what he needs to do. He needs Newcastle at the bottom, as if they've just came into the Premier League, and he needs to grow them and take them up and move them up. I think if Unai Emery came in, I think it would have been the wrong appointment. I think they got it spot on.
And I think also their whole season is going to be defined, in my opinion, on instant impact, which is worrying if you're a Newcastle United fan. And I'm sure if Newcastle United fans are listening, they'll say, we've got a January transfer window to turn things around. But, you know, ultimately, Eddie Howe watches from the stands at a big away game at Brighton, and they battled back well to get a point.
Yeah.
And the red card wasn't punishment enough, because if that foul doesn't happen, Callum Wilson wins them the game. But now Howe comes into the dugout, and Newcastle's fixtures, just by the chance that they fall, is home to Brentford, away at Arsenal, home to Norwich City, home to Burnley. And if they can take, and they should take, 9 points out of those 4 games, or even 7, they'll probably move out of the relegation zone or close. They'll have momentum on their side. They'll have got wins under their belt, and they'll start to be able to look up and plan for January. However, if Howe doesn't have an instant impact in those games, if he doesn't take enough from those matches against Brentford, Arsenal, Norwich and Burnley, from that point onwards in December, Newcastle United have got Leicester, Liverpool, Manchester City, Manchester United, Everton and Southampton up until January the 2nd. So they could enter the January transfer window so far adrift if those fixtures go according to paper. And that's why I think the next 4 games are so important.
Massive. Some people go back to Eddie Howe when he got the Burnley job. Do you think that Burnley just wasn't the right place for him, and Newcastle, with the way they want to play football, is a bit more suited?
Yeah, I don't think it was the wrong place for him, because it's exactly the kind of club that he knows how to operate in. Sometimes things just don't work out. You know, actually, Newcastle is the anomaly here. Eddie Howe has never had a massive club in terms of history and fan base. He's never had a mega rich owner. Nobody in the history of football has had an owner like the ownership group at Newcastle United, where albeit within financial fair play, money isn't an object, and the manager of Newcastle United has to effectively be a coach, a brand spokesman, a spokesperson for Saudi Arabia. They have to play the game of global football because of where the majority of the ownership group are based. And at the same time, they have to provide the fans week in, week out with enterprising, attacking football, win or lose. That's sort of the Newcastle United way. And that's the expectation at the football club. And luckily for Eddie Howe, his natural style fits into that, which means that if you take that style and add budget and resource, it should become something that Newcastle fans warm to and enjoy very quickly. So it isn't like another manager that would feel pressure to come in and change their style. And the only sort of caveat to that is obviously the Newcastle fans also did like Rafa Benitez, and you would certainly not call Rafa Benitez's style of football enterprising and attacking. It was much more regimented and stagnant at times. He is a manager that prides himself on his organization and his tactics, whereas I think Howe is much more of a risk-reward, free-flowing style of football that is a little bit more akin to Kevin Keegan. It's not as gung-ho as Keegan, and it's not as direct as Keegan. Howe kind of prioritizes counter-attacking football, longer passes, wider football, changes of direction, set pieces, whereas I think kind of Keegan was much more gung-ho, will just outscore you and will win football matches. And they did that against my side, Leicester, by the way, when Shearer got that famous hat-trick and they beat us in the Premier League 4-3 in one of the sort of classic games. But, you know, the whole point here for Howe is that Newcastle isn't a fit because it's not a fit to anyone. Newcastle it's an unknown, but it's an exciting unknown. So what you need a not just a manager, but a personality with the right temperament to handle the dynamic behind the scenes and to still gain success and quickly on the field. And I think he's amenable enough, he's intelligent enough, he is strategic enough to be able to tick a lot of boxes for Newcastle United. And worst case, I think if Howe doesn't work, in my opinion, it won't be because he takes Newcastle down. I think if Howe doesn't work, it will be because he keeps Newcastle up, and then somebody else who is either bigger or more fitting with the wider club goals is seen as the right person to take the reins on. So, you know, I'd be staggered if Newcastle go down with their resource and with a new manager. It could happen. But if they stay up, for me, Howe's succeeded. And then the following season is intriguing because what expectations do you put on the following season? If Newcastle stay up on the last day of the season by a point, the following season, when you wipe the slate clean and you have a summer transfer window, what expectations do you put on that season? Because I would still say 10th to 14th. And then the following season, 8th to 10th. And then the season after that, Europe. But if the ownership group put Europe as the expectation next season, that's when Howe's under pressure.
And that's the problem. And that's where I think they could get into trouble. Because I would like Newcastle to build gradually. Because that way then they're not stockpiling, but they're not bringing in a certain player and then he's gone a long contract and then he can't shift that player. They're not trying to bring in players who are on big wages, who are maybe coming to the end of their career that think they're going to get a last payday. We saw it at QPR. We've seen it at many other clubs that they try and just do everything instantly. And it does. We've seen it with Man City where they tried to do it instantly and they realised it wasn't working that way and then they had to start bringing in the right player. But surely the best way is to do it gradually.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's going to say they're going to do it gradually, and that is the only way, unless you either bring in a marquee signing that changes the dynamic or the current squad just click. Like Leicester went from bottom of the Premier League at Christmas to going down nailed on with less than 10 games to go to staying up to winning the Premier League with essentially the same squad of players, just a different manager. And a lot of that momentum was down to Nigel Pearson. And when he left unexpectedly, Ranieri was able to capitalize on that. So I think the only positive for me for Newcastle United is that as they look to get this success quickly, it doesn't, in my opinion, need as much of the mass overhaul as some fans and a lot of the football community might think. Because as I look at their current crop of players and what Howe is inheriting, I don't see a side that is condemned to be relegation fodder. I don't see a squad that strikes me as championship. What I see is a lot of players who don't know their role, who are out of form, or who haven't gelled with the team. But Alan St. Maximin, Callum Wilson, I think you'd put Joe Willock into the category as well. I like both goalkeepers actually at Newcastle, Dubravka and Darlow. I think Almiron on his day as well. All players that for me are already 8th to 16th in the Premier League, would be starting or close to starting in most of those teams, or certainly in the mix anyway. Yeah. So when you've got a goal scorer like Wilson, when you've got a creative player like St. Maximin, what's lacking is the direction and also the freedom, because often they're playing in a team that, particularly in the first half of football matches, are just forced back. They're negative. They're playing deep. They've got no outlet. They're stranded. There's no balance to the side, because Newcastle ultimately are terrified about opening up because they concede too many goals. So if I'm Eddie Howe, first of all, I'm dealing with the back and I'm getting ball playing defenders and I'm stabilizing to the point where I'm confident that when we go forwards, those we're leaving back are good enough to offer that protection, and then you can play a more expansive brand of football. And I think the ownership group have said many times they're patient about their expectations. But as I said before, they're bound to say that when the team are in the relegation zone. So the proof is going to be in the pudding, and we'll find out next season based on who they buy and how they act if they end up winning one, losing one, drawing one, and how the fan base act as well, whether 10th next season is good enough, or whether everyone just feels like, oh, it's mid-table mediocrity for the richest club in the world. And that richest club in the world tag, even though there's financial fair play, and even though they're not just going to spend billions and billions overnight, that tagline hovering over them is going to work against them to some extent, because exactly the same as a record football signing arriving with a big price tag above their shoulders, it puts that extra incentive to say, well, why are we not in the Champions League or Europe? Because we've spent potentially more than anyone else.
But you've got to think, how far back was you? Like, that's where you've got to think of it. And as you said there, you picked out those players there that are players that could get into any team in the top 8 to 16. However, there are players in that team who are just not good enough for Newcastle, and are part of the reason why they are down there. Not to dig out any individual players, but there's just
Joe Linton.
And they cost £40 million, so that's how badly wrong you can get it. That's how badly wrong you can get it.
Apparently, he's buzzing on the training pitch. I heard today. I heard
that he's still got a contract.
Yeah. Eddie Howe, he's been saying that. It was asked about Joe Linton, and he was saying, "Yeah, this guy's been on it. You know, I'm going to give him a second chance." And I think even the Newcastle fans, they're going a bit like, now they're hearing Eddie Howe say it. They're all going, "Yeah, hold on a minute. He has got a bit of this and a bit of that."
Yeah, and thanks to Leicester, every club is now tagged with, well, Leicester did it. So when it comes to winning the league, when it comes to getting that top 4, thank you very much, Leicester, because it's always going to be thrown in everyone's faces. Before we go, I have to ask you a couple of questions. Could you tell us about the you beat Diego Maradona in a keep you happy challenge? How go on, tell us.
I did, yeah. So I was working out in Dubai at the time, and Maradona had come over to manage a football club called Al Wasl in Dubai. And it was strange, because you naturally think, when you're of my generation, even though he was kind of at his peak before I was born, you're still aware, much like Pele, of this icon. So I expected him to have like an entourage and be very inaccessible, but he was living in quite a humble house on the beachfront. And things weren't going that well at Al Wasl, and they weren't even getting that bigger attendances. So in the post-match press conferences, you got a fair amount of access to him because there was probably only 500 fans there and 10 journalists, especially when the honeymoon period of him joining had worn off. So when things weren't going very well, I got a call completely out of the blue. And around the same time, another one of my colleagues at the local paper called Chris also got a call. And both of us, in the space of probably a month, me for broadcast and him for the newspaper he was writing for, were called out the blue and told basically that Maradona wanted to see us because he wanted to do some local press. So I found myself in this villa with him doing an interview and not understanding a word that was said and getting the kind of gestures to kind of anticipate what he was alluding to. And in those days, partly for time and partly because like these live translations didn't really exist, and you didn't really want to waste your time getting translation to long answers, I only actually translated the interview afterwards. And I noticed when I translated the interview, because I thought he was just sort of moaning about his Al Wassel job, he basically said towards the end of the interview that he's annoyed that people treat him like a god and not a human. And he wants to be able to join in five-a-side games, and he wants to be able to integrate himself into the community. So when I heard that, I reached back out and I said, well, come and play a game of five-a-side football, and we'll cover it for the radio station and for the magazine that I was writing for. So I thought he's never going to turn up before, anybody else, and he's probably won't even turn up at all. And we start going down to the five-a-side pitch, and you sort of look around and there's nobody there, and you think, he's not coming. And then you just sort of look around and there's this small little man doing laps around the five-a-side area. And he's been there for about 20 minutes and he's warming up. And when we got to the end of the game, his team won. I was on the other team. In fairness, five-a-side's about a goalkeeper, and they had a good goalkeeper and we didn't. But he was very, very good. And you have that respect almost when he's on the ball, just to let him do whatever he wants to do because he's Maradona. So then afterwards, we were sort of having a laugh, and luckily we had a few Spanish speakers, and I was just doing a little trick on my left foot. And I've got one showboat trick. I'm like rubbish at football, but I've got one showboat trick.
I was going to ask you, can you play?
I'm like
around the world.
It's sort of my own version of around the world. But actually, what I do is I flick the ball up. I flick the ball up and I balance it on the side of my heel on my left foot, and then I spin around in a circle with the ball on the heel. So I do a full 360 turn, and the ball doesn't move from my heel. And that's my kind of little trick. It's called the pelican. And
did you make that? Is that your name? You gave it?
I gave it. I actually did it when I went hiking on Kilimanjaro, and we played a football match. Played a football match on the top of Kilimanjaro for charity, and I did it at the top of Kilimanjaro, and it was named the Pelican up there, and I've kept it as the Pelican ever since.
Brilliant.
But anyway, long story short, he saw me do that, and then he's like, "All right, we're having a kick-up challenge." So it was just simple. You do as many kick-ups as you can. You get 2 goes. And obviously, when you lose control of the ball, your score stops. And I think I beat him by about 80 to about 60. So that was my claim to fame.
I'd still be claiming it now. Don't worry, I'd have a T-shirt. I beat Maradona in kick-ups. It does. I won't mention the fact that he did 45 laps and played a 2-hour five-a-side game.
Yeah.
Ignore that. And won.
See, no one's ever going to beat that, are they? If you're at a party or something and they've got their story, they're waiting for their one to come up. But Ben goes first, and they go, right, it's your turn, and they'll be like, "No, you're all right."
The lights come on. He's doing the Pelican, like Daniel's son doing the last movie, Karate Kid. He's getting ready for it. Love it, absolutely love it. I wanted to ask you a question about being a commentator. How did you get into that? How did you get into becoming a commentator?
My advice to anyone that wants to sort of get into commentary is 2 things. First is to start by utilizing your own platforms and to watch as many matches as you can, and to listen to other commentators to work out what aspects you like. The key is never to just mimic. Like a lot of people say, I want to be Clive Tilsley or Martin Tyler or Peter Drury or John Motson, but that's them. And each of them have got a very distinct voice, a very distinct style. And, you can go from Jonathan Pearce shouting and screaming, down to Tyler now, who is really quite sanguine and understated.
Yes.
Then Clive Tilsley's probably somewhere in between the two. And Barry Davies is a good example again of someone that knows how to kind of withhold their sound and their passion for the moment. So my first kind of bit of advice in terms of getting into commentary is to know what kind of commentator you are. Like, what are you going to add? And then once you know what you're going to add, you can start, at least in this era, putting out your voice onto digital platforms, whether that's putting your voice over a TikTok, doing a mock commentary and recording it on a Zoom, because then you've got kind of a chance to learn the trade of the tools. And the sort of dirty secret of commentary is that some of it's on site, but the vast majority is what's called off tube, which means that if you get in a habit of practicing to a TV, when you get your first break, you're highly likely to be doing it off a TV in a studio somewhere. And therefore, can you actually identify the players in real time, in the split second? And what can you add? Because there's no point on a TV in saying the ball's on the left-hand side, it's a corner on the near side, because these kind of things people can see. You have to be able to add something, and occasionally less is more. So the first thing to do is to work out, to get into commentary, what's your brand and what's your style. So then when you go to people, you're able to either show them something or you're able to explain what you can bring to the role. And then the second way, and how I got in, is just sort of persistence, and to realize that your route to commentary won't start with commentary. So for me, it was about going in age 16 to BBC Radio Leicester, where I made tea and answered the phones. And then after about a year and a half, just before I went to university, I was allowed to read the football classifieds for 2 minutes, all the local Leicestershire results like Oadby Town and so on, Tamworth United. And I was able to go, Oadby Town 1, Tamworth United 0. And you get a little bit of kind of practice that way. And then the third stage was then when I went to university in Oxford, BBC Oxford sent me out to a local game like Abingdon Town, and I would do 30 seconds on a mobile phone. So then suddenly you're learning how to broadcast live, you're learning how to not trip over your words, but you're basically just networking. And at the same time now, people shouldn't be afraid to go to matches on behalf of their blogs, on behalf of their podcasts. They shouldn't be afraid to reach out and network to people in a way that even 10 years ago you couldn't really do. But now you've got Twitter, you've got LinkedIn, you can probably get a press pass if you're a blogger, and then you're going to be rubbing shoulders with all the kind of bigger names from the more traditional linear outlets. And then eventually your opportunity will come. And when your opportunity comes, it's important to then obviously take it, but take it in a way where you never forget that scrutiny. So that's why I started by saying, think about why you're a commentator and how you're going to project yourself and what you're going to add that's different to other people. Because once you finally get the gig, it's really easy to then stop listening to yourself, stop scrutinizing yourself. So I, for example, will always listen back to the highlights of the commentary. Sometimes I'll listen back to the full match of the commentaries that I do. And when you notice something that you've said that you don't like, you clock it to improve. So I think it was Darren Fletcher when I was at 5 Live. I think it was Fletch, but it may have been one of the other commentators like Simon Brotherton. He would do a bingo grid on his commentary sheet of 40 words, common words. And every time he used a word, he would tick off a word to make sure that then the next time the goalkeeper made a save, he didn't naturally repeat the word. And there's times during a commentary where you are reaching for that word, and there's a split second where you may not have that word, and just having like 20 words in front of you is one tip. So you're not always going to go good save, great save, good save again. You're going to say extraordinary save, terrific save, wonderful save, world-class save. And I don't actually know if it was Fletch or another commentator, but that was one little tip that was given to me to kind of broaden
That's a great
the
tip.
vocabulary.
That's a great
tip.
I
thought that was good.
That's really good. Really, I mean, that answer was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I was taking notes, by the way. The question was for me. No,
next watch along.
Yeah, no, it's because I've always been interested in it. I used to get my mates hyped up when they're playing computer games, and I'd do the commentary over the computer games, and they'd be shooting from all over the place because I'll be ramping it up. But then, as you said there, that was because I was it was probably Clive Tilsdale, where I was probably mimicking his voice and his like higher pitched tones and stuff like that. But then that wouldn't sound good if I was to do commentary myself. Is it a case you'd use a natural voice, but maybe accentuate it a bit more in certain ways, add a bit more excitement to it?
Yeah, I think it has to be authentic. And I also think that not much of good commentary is scripted. You might script an intro, but if you're scripting too much else, then you're asking for trouble, because you're never going to be able to verbalize a moment exactly if you've pre-written a script for it. So even if you've got like somebody's 100th goal, or even if you want a soundbite about winning a World Cup, it's dangerous in a live environment to have that written or to have memorized it, because when the moment happens, if it's not exactly like your words, then you've not relayed that moment, and it won't quite sound right. It will sound like staged, but it also won't bring to life the reality of the moment. So I think the thing with commentary, and I always encourage people to start in radio over TV, because radio really challenges you, because you're the eyes and the ears. So you have to make it an entertaining spectacle. Like in TV, if there's a lull in the game, there's a lull in the game, and you can talk about stuff and you can fill some of the time, but ultimately you've got a visual. But in radio, you can't just stop because the game's boring. So you constantly have to build this notion of it's entertaining, even if it's the worst 0-0 ever, because you're captivating an audience. And, you might use humor to paint the fact that it's not a particularly interesting match, but you've still got to do something to captivate the audience. And radio, you're just talking and talking and talking. And that, I think, is how you test the tone and the style and the way that you broadcast. But I think also the commentary trick is to get caught yourself in the moment and become a part of it. Not in an egotistical way where, like some of the American play-by-plays, you're stealing the moment's thunder, but you are the voice track accompanying something that people are watching because they're passionate about it and it means something to them. So you have to some extent, let your gut go with it and be very instinctive about it, and not think about, am I intonating that right word? Am I stressing the word enough? Am I shouting enough? Am I screaming enough? Am I exciting enough? Like, as the ball moves, your words will move. So if I'm particularly with radio, less so with TV, but to some extent with TV. But if I'm seeing the ball move in radio and closer it gets to the goal, it will be the same in TV. As it starts to progress, my words are basically reflecting it. And I always tell people, if I'm training up a commentator, exactly that forget the words for now. Just think about, almost if you're humming along to a football match, or if you're saying gibberish to a football match, just try and use your pace to follow the ball. So if the ball starts slow and it's moving along the back and it's A and they're passing to B, and then it comes into midfield and you suddenly sense in your tone that there might be a chance on here, and you're naturally going to get a little bit quicker. And then as you get to kind of the edge of the area, it's like weaving, interchanging play. You're going to start talking a little bit faster. It's definitely intricate. It's definitely exciting. It's definitely fast. The ball's about to go into the box. And that's when you've got your crescendo, where you've either then got to go up and down.
I remember that when I was a kid. I used to do that with cars. When I used to buy the little cars, I used to make teams up. I used to commentate with a car. My parents used to think he's mad. He's going off his head. And I used to get a tape recorder and record myself commentating. And then I used to just keep playing it back. I used to love it. But it's funny, like listening to Ben, because like we've had a few different comments, and we had Ian Danter on, didn't we? And we had Dan Roan, and I think Ian Danter was saying once that he spends days and days and days getting little bits of information on every player, but making sure that it's different from what everyone else is. And he said he probably won't even use it. He spent days getting this one bit of information, but he'll think, well, I've never used it. I've just done the whole 90 minutes and not use it. And I think Dan Roan said to Marie on one of our shows that, he said, if you commentate, you can't go out, you can't drink, you're not allowed to drink, you got to stay in, because if your voice is different, the people who are listening to you, they'll notice it. So it's really interesting to listen. Yeah.
I mean, actually, the point that Dance made is really key, not just because you have to have every eventuality covered, but you have to have that cutthroat editorial nature to withhold something, even if you've spent hours and hours and hours researching it, and even if it's a really good stat. And the best commentators withhold and use relevant information to the moment, rather than give you a barrage of information just because they've happened to put the time and energy into researching it. And sometimes as a profession, we come across a bit kind of know-it-all-y because we're dropping in facts and stats left, right and center in every break in play because we're so desperate to use the research that we found.
Yeah.
And it's a great point that really you should absolutely not say anything statistical or factual unless it's adding to the narrative that people are watching, and in TV, unless it's in sync with the game and the pictures. So it is a good tip to research like you're going to need everything, but then broadcast with that cutthroat mentality of only using the things that are editorially strong and relevant.
All right, Ben.
Brilliant.
Absolutely brilliant tonight. Really enjoyed it. Love to have you on again. Yeah. Maybe for if it's for Leicester, a Leicester preview, a Leicester post-match summit. We just have to get you on again because, I was captivated by that. Your answers were excellent.
Thank you.
Yeah. I've enjoyed
Thank
it,
you
guys.
very much.
Absolute pleasure. And happy to come on again soon. Great to come on the show and keep up the good work.
Thanks,
right,
Ben.
Cool. Ben, where can everyone find you if they want to go onto your Twitter or anything like that?
They can find me at JacobsBen on Twitter. They can find me at Ben David Jacobs on Instagram. If you want to see photos of me and Tyson and Zlatan, you can go there.
Whoa.
And then they can find me in, at the moment, New York in person, although I will be back in London in just a few weeks. But obviously CBS's HQ is in New York. So I'm on the other side of the pond at the moment.
Oh, you have to say hello to Marie.
As you said, with all them people, Mike Tyson, Zlatan, the list of questions I had on all of those things, Usain Bolt was one I was going to ask you about, but it was, like I said, was drawn in by everything else you said. So we've got to get you on for a part 2, maybe. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe button, people. Thank you very much again for joining us, Ben. Steve, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Cheers, mate. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone who's watching. Hit that like and subscribe. Peace out. Stay safe and wash your hands.